Good morning from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, and this is your Access and Privacy Online News Summary for Saturday, March 22nd. In this week's podcast, local coverage returns to the Canadian press. We have multiple stories that put Premier Tim Houston and Nova Scotia back in the spotlight for aggressive legislation, plus a roundup of local stories across Canada, intersecting access to information, privacy, and information management. There's still plenty of chaos coming from south of the border, impacting Americans' privacy concerns, and we see a series of fascinating stories where the U.S. judiciary is subpoenaing foreign financial information to support a Russian citizen's attempt to possibly evade sanctions. Looking ahead to a potential Canadian federal election, we'll highlight moves by conservative governments at both the provincial and federal levels. Danielle Smith in Alberta aims to block federal oversight of the oil and gas sector, while her federal counterparts promise corporate tax cuts for the same industry, despite climate change concerns revealed through access to information. As always, you can find links to all the related stories in the show notes. It's a jam-packed week, so let's dive in. Returning to controversy in Nova Scotia. Tim Houston's legislation in Nova Scotia continues to come under scrutiny. The Omnibus Bill 1 originally included amendments that would have allowed the progressive conservative government to fire the Auditor General and non-unionized bureaucrats without reason and veto the release of audit reports. After receiving pushback, Houston said he would withdraw the proposals that would have allowed the government to fire the Auditor General without cause and veto the public release of reports mentioned in the previous story. He also claimed there would likely be changes to the bill that the province's Freedom of Information Commissioner said would weaken the public's right to access government records and documents. Nova Scotia NDP is calling on citizens to speak out against what they describe as overreaching legislation. By urging public engagement, the NDP hopes to spark broader discussions about accountability and transparency in provincial policymaking. Shifting our focus from Nova Scotia to the rest of Canada, we have more stories where transparency and privacy are at the forefront, including one case that FIPA was contacted about regarding a possible misuse of personal information. A local homeowner in Vancouver discovered campaign signs on their property without prior consent. FIPA was contacted on the issue, and as Executive Director Jason Waiwata highlights, the dynamic definitely raises questions about privacy and property rights. In separate news from the province, proposed legislation may grant Cabinet the power to rapidly adjust regulations if American tariffs hit. The bill would give Cabinet the power to make regulations addressing challenges or anticipated challenges, which would not require debate in the legislature. The bill would also give the Cabinet the power to implement charges on vehicles using BC infrastructure, such as highways and ferries. It would also eliminate provincial trade barriers in the province, allowing goods produced, manufactured, or grown elsewhere in Canada to be sold or used in BC. While efficiency is a factor, critics caution it could centralize decision-making and leave the public with minimal input on critical trade and economic policies. From Maggie McIntosh, LGI reporter at the Winnipeg Free Press, documents obtained through access to information requests indicate the University of Winnipeg faces significant budget shortfalls. Since the start of the school year, U of W has adopted a hiring freeze, limited discretionary spending, and suspended its women's soccer team, among other cost-saving measures. Senior administration recently hired a consulting firm against the backdrop of a new austerity agenda to analyze its share of provincial grants in comparison to the University of Manitoba and Brandon University. These revelations highlight the role that transparency plays in ensuring that public institutions remain accountable and financially sound, prompting calls for more open disclosure of university spending. From Bruce McIntyre, LGI reporter at the Eganville Leader, a 61-year-old Laurentian Valley man who repeatedly entered his neighbor's garage to steal beer and other items on his property was sentenced to 4 months house confinement, including wearing a GPS ankle monitor to ensure he never stepped foot on his neighbor's property for the foreseeable future. This is after he appeared in court last year for similar charges on stealing the neighbor's beer and sausages, prompting surveillance equipment to be set up. Though this may seem like a simple theft case, the role of home security and surveillance equipment is an important consideration in this matter. Plans to create a whale sanctuary have hit a roadblock, as local communities express concerns about whether proper steps were taken to consult them. Documents obtained through the province's Freedom of Information law state that the US-based group won't be granted a crown lease for 81 hectares of land and water near Wine Harbor, Nova Scotia, unless the landowners grant unanimous consent. Only 2 out of 5 properties adjacent to where the group plans to build a huge floating net enclosure have given consent, with one flat out refusing. Despite this, the executive director of the nonprofit wrote a letter asking Nova Scotia's Department of Natural Resources to change the rules, who refused. Environmental advocates stress the potential benefits, but local voices question if the required environmental assessments and permissions were properly disclosed. It's a reminder that thorough, transparent processes are essential in community-driven projects. South of the border, privacy battles, administrative upheavals, and questions around government data collection are making headlines. Let's explore how developments in the U.S. continue to shape privacy and access to information debates. From Washington, top House Democrats continue pushing for details on a government office known as DOJ, arguing it might operate outside U.S. legal frameworks and collect sensitive information. The request seeks all DOJ directives, guidance, and analyses around the firing of federal workers, including the dismissal of inspectors general and the undoing of various government agencies. Meanwhile, the chilling effects of dictator-like behavior is having the intended effect on the courts. Federal judges in 2 separate lawsuits refused to order the Trump administration to not destroy U.S. Agency for International Development records. This was after attorneys argued they had disposed of only old or unneeded documents and that it is no longer destroying records anyway. This lack of intervention raises alarms about how thoroughly critical data is preserved. Separately, a federal judge is weighing whether to prevent DOJ from accessing Social Security records of millions of Americans, citing potential overreach. This comes after a group of labor unions and retirees sued the Trump administration and asked the court to issue an emergency order. At the same time, 2 Democrats at the Federal Trade Commission were abruptly fired, prompting critics to label this a consolidation of power. Commissioners serve 7-year terms and cannot be removed without cause. In another conflict, threats to withdraw transit funds from New York create questions about how far the administration is willing to go to assert authority in local matters. Trump said the threats will go through unless a plan to address crime is provided. Finally, in a clear case of double standards, IRS agents framed as whistleblowers who investigated Hunter Biden received promotions. This despite whistleblowers raising concerns about Trump's actions being punished. All these stories underscore a broader concern. The intersection of politics with oversight can sideline privacy protections and public transparency if left unchecked. While federal agencies wrestle with domestic controversies, another branch of the U.S. legal system is delving into transnational cases, particularly where sanctions and high-stakes financial assets intersect. A series of court proceedings in the United States revolves around a Russian individual fighting to reclaim a mega yacht seized under sanction-related actions. Attorneys have sought to subpoena foreign financial records, especially from Antigua, to trace the yacht's ownership and potential sale proceeds. The records would include wire transfers and other transactions related to Antigua's prime minister and others. Antigua's government denies withholding key details, but the dispute highlights how global transparency and privacy laws collide when sanctions take effect. For observers, it's a rare glimpse into how international finance, U.S. courts, and privacy regulations converge in sanction evasion cases. Shifting from global entanglements to personal privacy, new cases suggest that in the U.S., your protection may depend on who you are and how much influence you wield. U.S. officials are refusing to disclose Prince Harry's immigration documents, citing legal protections and privacy rights. The legal battle is led by a conservative group that is pushing to find out whether Harry lied about past drug use on his immigration forms. The group claims intense public interest on whether there is preferential treatment at play. Critics question whether a high-profile individual receives preferential treatment, while supporters argue it is a standard policy respecting personal data. In another case, the courts have restricted public access to documents concerning the tragic passing of Gene Hackman and his spouse. The Hackman family's legal team continued to stress that such records are private under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, while media outlets seeking clarity face legal hurdles, prompting debate over whether certain families, due to wealth or fame, are better able to shield personal information from public scrutiny. Experts say that some medical information, such as sensitive images, are not considered public records under the State Inspection of Public Records Act. Still, the bulk of death investigations by law enforcement and autopsy reports by medical investigators are typically considered public records under state law in the spirit of ensuring government transparency and accountability. The question of how fame or political power shapes privacy doesn't stop there. We've got several more stories, each shining a light on the push and pull between public interest and personal confidentiality. A high-profile defamation lawsuit from President Trump looms over 60 Minutes. Despite this legal intimidation, the program continues probing White House actions. Trump's lawsuit accuses 60 Minutes of election interference for the way it edited Bill Whitaker's interview last fall with Trump's 2024 opponent, Kamala Harris. The battle raises the issue of whether strong journalistic platforms can withstand deep-pocketed legal challenges to quell dissent and accountability. Next, in a case that highlights issues around corporate secrecy with public safety, a whistleblower alleges that, prior to a tragic accident, he flagged serious safety defects. After a 14-year-old boy fell to his death, the family reached a settlement with the ride's operators. However, a maintenance technician was fired. The technician's attorneys argue it was retaliation for the safety concerns that had been flagged. Austin Campbell Alexander said in the state whistleblower lawsuit that the Orlando freefall ride at Icon Park had sensors, which were modified to accommodate people whose height or weight were outside safety limits. Now, questions swirl over whether private communications or internal documents were withheld from investigators. And in other monitoring incidents, newly revealed documents show repeated near-miss incidents long before a catastrophic U.S. event. When Congress added 10 new daily flights to Washington, D.C.'s Reagan National Airport, the Federal Aviation Administration had data showing an unnerving number of near misses, which were not previously known. Data collected by the FAA shows close calls were far more frequent than travelers and outside aviation experts knew. The airport was also built for 15 million passengers a year, not the 25 million traveling through it annually. Observers wonder whether these warnings were buried due to liability concerns, again spotlighting how limited transparency can stifle preventative action. Now let's pivot away from North America to examine foreign aid and technology in parts of Africa where privacy and information management also come into play. As extremist threats escalate, the U.S. is cutting aid to the Ivory Coast. This is after tens of thousands of refugees went to the northern Ivory Coast among record violence levels in surrounding areas. Over the last decade, West Africa has been shaken by extremist uprisings and military coups. Critics say the criteria behind these decisions remain opaque, leaving local communities uncertain about future support. This is part of a broader pattern where foreign policy and security interests often overshadow clarity about how, why, and when aid is distributed. In South Sudan, a new pilot project aims to use mobile tech to connect survivors with medical and legal resources. An Israel-based organization in South Sudan piloted a chatbot it created on WhatsApp. It prompts questions for its staff to ask survivors of sexual assault to anonymously share their experiences. The information is put into the phone while speaking to the person, and the bot immediately notifies a social worker there's a case, providing help to the person within hours. While promising, implementing these programs responsibly requires strict data protection, especially in conflict zones where sensitive information could endanger lives. It is a potent reminder that whether it's government or nonprofit ventures, handling personal data safely is crucial. Let's bring it back to Canada. As we near a federal election, debates around climate, resource management, and accountability dominate discussions. Two stories in particular showcase the policies and performance of conservative leaders at provincial and federal levels. Premier Danielle Smith is championing legislation that would bar federal inspectors from collecting environmental information at oil and gas sites without provincial authorization. She says it's necessary because she doesn't trust how the federal government will calculate greenhouse gas emissions as it crafts its proposed emissions cap. Smith also says emissions data is the property of the Alberta government and says if a private company doesn't comply, the province could make it a condition of its license. Supporters claim it protects Alberta's autonomy and the energy sector from intrusive oversight. Critics argue this move undermines federal environmental standards and hampers transparent monitoring of resource extraction. Shifting to the federal stage, from John Woodside, LGI reporter at Canada's National Observer. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has pledged to eliminate industrial carbon pricing if his party forms government. Prime Minister Mark Carney removed carbon pricing as one of its first actions in office on Friday. But following that move, Poilievre is keeping the debate alive. Poilievre said that if elected, he would repeal the industrial carbon price, known as the output-based pricing system or large emitter trading system, which is the single biggest driver of emission reductions in Canada. Proponents of this platform believe it will ease financial burdens on businesses, especially within the oil and gas industry. Opponents counter that scrapping carbon pricing jeopardizes Canada's climate commitments and ignores evidence revealed through access to information about the urgency of environmental protections. Beyond these policy positions, public scrutiny of government ethics and transparency is intensifying as Canada looks ahead to its 2025 federal election. In the most recent Ontario provincial election, civil society groups were in the field considering the commitments and positions of political parties with a variety of tools. FIPA sent out a series of questions to the parties and candidates. Democracy Watch has a long-standing report card evaluation of party platforms. Both of these help voters understand where each party stands on transparency and privacy issues, critical information heading into any election. Because of that importance, we took the opportunity to have a discussion with Executive Director Duff Conacher from Democracy Watch that will bring you as a longer commentary in the week ahead. In the meantime, here's an excerpt.
Yeah, we did something a bit different, and we've always done something a bit different, which is a report card on the party's platform. And our view has always been, if it's not in the platform, it's not important to the party. And saying to voters with their platform, this is what's important to us. And when we started out, platforms were in print form back in '93. And so there wasn't this option of referring people to a website. And some of the parties complained and said, oh, but you know that that's our party policy to change this or change that, and you should be taking that into account in your report card. And our position was, if it's not in your platform, this is what you're saying you're going to do if you're elected. I don't care whether it's your party policy. If you wanted people to know that it's your party policy and you're going to act on it, put it in your platform. And that excuse has just faded away totally with, I don't even know whether any of the parties produce printed copies of their platforms anymore. I haven't seen one in a long time. And yeah, maybe they don't want to fill their platform with a bunch of detailed promises. But in each section, let's say it's about access to information, then say, we have more detailed proposals of things we will act on, and provide the link to your party policies or to an expanded platform on your website. There's just no excuse for saying to voters or claiming, oh no, there's a bunch of other things we'll do, but we didn't include them in our platform. And so that's why we don't do surveys, because surveys give the parties an opportunity to say they're going to do a bunch of things that they aren't saying to voters they're going to do. And that's why instead we do report cards. And just one other thing about the report cards, we always do give a dishonesty downgrade in our report cards, because politicians have shown that they bait voters with false promises across all the parties. And so we put a warning in our report card that people should take all these promises with a grain of salt, and the grades should likely be lower in every area because some of those promises are likely false.
I hope that you found today's stories helpful in staying informed about the latest issues surrounding privacy, information management, and public transparency. Be sure to subscribe and tune in later this week when we bring you that discussion on the tools of democratic accountability with Duff Conacher, as well as our sit-down interview with BC Information and Privacy Commissioner Michael Harvey following his keynote at the VIPS conference. To help us keep the mics on, be sure to subscribe through FIPA News Monitoring or consider a donation. Our writer is Sean Fisk. Original music in today's show was composed by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, your host and producer. Thank you for joining. A big FIPA thank you to all the contributors, reporters, and outlets that make this podcast possible, and to you, our listeners, who helped make this successful. Stay safe and stay informed.